Right, good afternoon, welcome. We're here to present on implementing the 2019 Traffic Analysis Toolbox, hopefully complementing what Chung presented on yesterday. I'm Matt Best, along with my colleagues Josh Hoffman, Megan Hokeless, Jeshwant Ganesan, who's putting tomorrow, so he gets a reprieve, and AKM Abir, who's unable to make it, unfortunately. Just quickly, just do some quick history update on the 2019 and a couple project examples, and then we'll wrap up. So the 2004 version, the main topics: data collection, model development, calibration, validation, alternatives analysis. Not much to say, more to say since it is out of date at this point. But just one point of comparison for later, I wanted to point out is the Wisconsin DOT freeway calibration criteria, which was provided as an example. This might have been where we first were introduced to the GEH statistic. Just wanted to point out, I shouldn't speak for too many people. I know us, without any other sort of agency guidance, really kind of use this since it was kind of the only guidance we had at the time. I should point out looking at what the Wisconsin DOT looking at hourly flows, just the flows across the entire simulation time period, as well as travel times, again, across the entire simulation time period, like an average across that hour or whatever it might be. So 15 years later, we've got the updates, a lot of similar topics. Data collection, as we talked about a bit yesterday, looking at first model development, what do you need? Geometry, signal timing. Now what you need for cluster analysis, the amount of data, and thinking about what data you might need to be able to distinguish travel conditions within your study area. Calibration validation, a system measure and a local performance measure. We now have big data sources that we can use in Rick's Streetlight. Now there's also a little bit more of an emphasis on permanent count locations, as I think Chung mentioned yesterday, using infrastructure that we have available to us already to be able to adequately do the clustering. So again, we went through this yesterday, assembling our data, what we think can distinguish our travel conditions, doing the clustering and determining representative days. And then going on to calibration validation, this is an example of a system performance measure, like a travel time along a corridor, as well as bottleneck throughput, which would be our local. So one major difference to point out is just kind of the temporal nature, of the needs for the update. So looking at minimum of 15-minute intervals, so looking at what happens within the simulation time period, not just looking at an average across that however many hours it is. And then the number of runs, we talked about this yesterday, not needing an average of runs to which to compare to your field data. So we've gone through this a little bit, just go through it a little quickly. Criteria 1 and 2. Looking at the standard, looking at our representative day, the other days within that cluster, that standard deviation of whatever that measure may be, in this case, travel times at that 15-minute interval. Twice the standard deviation for the big band, once the standard deviation for the small band for criteria 2. I don't know if we talked about this much yesterday, but 2 critical time periods that we need to establish. So typically, in a case of travel times, it's the highest travel time followed by the second highest travel time in a non-consecutive interval. However, I think our discussions with FHWA has been that this is largely, this is up to the modeler to define really what those critical time periods are. So it could be, your heaviest 30-minute time period or your peak hour. It's just as long as you define that up front. I don't think we talked a lot about criteria 3 and 4 yesterday, so maybe it'd be good to go into a little more detail on that. The biodynamic absolute error threshold, we calculate this at each time interval, and it's basically looking at what the difference is between the representative day and all the other days within that cluster, and then summing those all up for a single number. And so what we're doing here is comparing that to the sum of our representative day compared to the simulation output. So basically, testing here is your simulation should not vary from the representative day more than kind of the variation within of the data within your cluster. And then 4, the this is kind of the overestimation, underestimation one. I think good way to illustrate this is what does not meet. We are consistently overestimating travel times there to significant degrees. This would not meet criterion 4, which is a real bummer if you've met the first 3 and then you get here and on your meeting. So, so Megan Hokeless will go through our first project example.
Just to give you a little background, this is one of we're going to go through the central segment for this project, but this is the Capital Express Mobility 35 project, and it is encompassed by the north, central, and south within the Austin area, from the Round Rock down to almost Buda. I don't know if anyone's really knows Texas, but it's a large area, but 35 is one of the main traveling points getting through Austin. A lot of truck traffic, a lot of commuters going downtown into, there's no, here, the central business district. A lot of the downtown offices are here, where a lot of commuters from outside are going in the mornings for going in the mornings and then going home in the evening. So more directionality in the model, but going into the central project specifically, TxDOT is our client. It's I-35, and it's an 8-mile freeway and frontage road segment in Austin, Texas. We have the project limits for this was US 290 east here up at the top, and then going all the way to SH 71 down here. But based off of the going, one intersection to at least meet the area of influence, and after discussions with FHWA, Chung, and TxDOT, we expanded beyond that to include the US 183 direct connects that had just been built on the north, as well as inclusion of the US 290 east that a lot of commuters do use to get from any outside going into downtown in the mornings. And we were looking at this project, which is recommending adding capacity to the network, a lot more lanes, frontage road. They want to do ramp reconfigurations, a managed high occupancy vehicle lanes throughout, doing this within Vista modeling, as well as the IIJR, the Interstate Access Justification Report to do so. Just a little more background, this segment from 290 East to SH 71 was the second most congested roadway in Texas in 2021. Just to kind of understand why this project is necessary and needed, and a main focus for TxDOT. Going through the data collection, we collected data in April and May of this year, after discussions with FHWA, TxDOT, to determine how long of a time period that we need. Usually it is recommended as the guidance, the toolbox states, a year, based on the project, and we do not have the detectors on each of the ramps to have a data collection. We can still use INREX and crash reports and whatnot, but we decided on 28 days for April and May of this year, at the main lanes along to capture the demand coming into the model, into the network, as well as a few locations in the project limits. For the one special thing, I don't know if y'all are aware, the I-35 in Austin has a upper and lower deck split in the main north of the downtown area. And it's really, you can take either one and you still can end up at the same place. So it's a little bit of a modeler's choice on how you'd want to do the clustering for this. So we did the main lane counts. We did ramps for 3 days at minimum based on just the high amount of, there were 80 plus ramps that were needing to be collected. And it was just not feasible to get collections for every single day within the period, the 28 days. So we had to do that. And we also collected for intersections for the 4 days, as well as any of the crash and precipitation weather data that we had. And this was all in coordination with our data collection plan was coordinated with FHWA and TxDOT to determine. Going into starting the clustering, we'll focus on the AM peak. So what we did was we looked at the main lane travel times, the demand, the crash severity, and precipitation. Texas is not fun. Texas drivers cannot drive in the rain. So it's always good to take that into consideration. And we also looked at the specific, we wanted to look at the travel times. Why was there a 40-minute travel time going southbound on that Monday? And just to make us aware of what was happening, and as we do the clustering analysis for this specific location, it was a SWAT incident that occurred at William Cannon, which was at the south end of our network, which closed the main lanes and created a shockwave backwards, just so we were aware of that. And so after we brought all of that, we had to normalize the data as the clustering analysis in the toolbox shows. And now we have it all, even though they were in different units to start with, we can now compare them all as we look into the representative data that we needed to do. With this, the k-means after doing the clustering, we tried to determine the optimal cluster size. For this clustering, we had 5 clusters. And then this kind of shows you how the 28 days fell into each cluster. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, kind of cluster 1. Cluster 2 and 3 are the weekends. Cluster 4 was more of the rain, and then cluster 5 was the one closure of the main lanes. And then kind of just a little more description on what each one and what clustering we wanted to model. And we determined with FHWA and TxDOT that the high demand and longer travel times is what we want to try to remediate and get a more reliable travel times. With that, we had to start data harmonization because we couldn't collect all days, all ramps for the whole 28 days. And so we had to first pick the representative day of the cluster, and we landed on Thursday, April 21st. And then from there, it was taking all of the ramps that were not collected at that time and adjusting, balancing to get a more accurate representation of that day and what was happening within the project limits. And although this is still a work in project with the harmonization and getting final approval from FHWA and TxDOT, we went ahead and created the bands that we were going to be calibrating to the travel time and bottleneck as shown here. And it's all a work in progress still, but I'll pass it along to Josh now for D10.
So hopefully I can be brief and expand and reinforce a little bit what Megan was saying. So Downtown 10 is located in the city of El Paso, Texas, which everybody knows what Texas is. It's the most western city in Texas. So they're in mountain time. So that's how west they are. So our client was TxDOT, obviously. Downtown 10, it's I-10, and it goes from Executive Center Boulevard just west of US 54. But that's the schematic limit. The area of influence actually was a little bit more than that, and that went beyond US 54. So you get that system interchange, and then also on the west side, we also got another system interchange. So we have a really robust network that we needed to model. It's about 8 miles in length, and the purpose of the project was to improve safety and mobility. And then the analysis, feeds the interstate access justification report. We initially started off thinking that 2 weeks worth of data was enough. So we got 3 locations on the main lanes for 2 weeks, and then we have 44 ramps within the study area, 80 plus intersections, some crash data from TxDOT, and then wind speed. I just want to point out that while Megan and her team collected rainy days, you have to be kind of aware of where you are, doing the analysis. So El Paso is in the mountain desert region of Texas, and so obviously they don't get any rain, but they do have a lot of wind. So we were thinking that wind speed would actually affect truck traffic, which they actually do have a lot of, and so that would actually slow down vehicles and flow of traffic. So I said initially we start off with 2 weeks, but after having long conversations with TxDOT and FHWA, we expanded that to 100 days. So, and if you think about like what the purpose of clustering is, we need to, identify several, like travel patterns, right? And if you only have 2 weeks, you're not going to get enough data points in order to get robust clusters. So 100 days, that was the sweet spot. So luckily we actually had a permanent count location within our project limits, so we could get the volume. So here's a snippet of the data starting in July 24th, 2021, and it actually went up to the end of October of 2021. However, when you're going to look at the data, you can't compare traffic volume with, let's say, the Beaufort number, which is the wind speed, because if you do that, then the volume is just going to overpower the smaller numbers, right? So you have to strip away the units and normalize it and put everything onto the same scale. So from 0 to 1, that's what we did. So that's the whole normalizing of the data. So once you normalize it, you can actually start doing your cluster analysis. But you need to also determine what you're going to have as your n number of clusters. And so we used the elbow method. There's several other methods that you can use, but we decided on the elbow method. And so basically what you see here is like an arm and the elbow. And so from cluster 2 to cluster 4, it goes down significantly. And then after that, it kind of tapers off. And so looking at that graph, you can say, okay, well, this particular peak period would have 4 clusters, because everything else beyond that, you're just going to get diminishing returns, and your clusters will just be kind of garbage. And so, and this actually worked out beautifully for us. So you can see here, cluster 1 has some random days in there, which I'll get to on the next slide. But then cluster 2, you can see that it's mostly weekends and holidays, and clusters 3 and 4 are basically the weekday traffic. And then putting this into a box-cox analysis, you can tell that for cluster 1, there is some crash experience for those days. And then they also have like a wide variety of different travel times and everything like that. I think probably because of the crashes. Cluster 2, lower volumes, higher speeds. And then with cluster 3 and 4, you have your high volumes, and then your different type of travel patterns. And so for in choosing the cluster, the clusters, we chose cluster 3, and that's because for the base on the spirit of the new toolbox, we want to select a cluster that has probably the most travel time reliability issues, just for the fact that we're not trying to model the most perfect day, but we're trying to model the most representative day. So once we figured that out, we'll select the day that's closest to the century within that cluster, and then start calibrating our model. I-10 El Paso, the travel times were pretty pretty close with each other, so there really wasn't too much variation. However, when we went into the volume calibration, we had a little bit more of a variability. And I guess really the key takeaway from this graph is that you can be like super close, and then you can, for one model run, and you can keep on, tweaking the driver behavior or lane change and parameters and stuff like that. But if you want to, if you can run it several times, you actually might be able to, find that model run that actually will suffice all the criteria.
Yeah, so just some additional tools. I think the main thing I want to point out is Scenario Manager, our calibration report. When we get there, I think we'll go through like 4 levels of review. So using Scenario Manager, allowing us to kind of, as these projects are time sensitive, to continue the coding and everything, and we avoid a lot of rework. And then just some major takeaways, FH coordination, obviously key. Chung and his group have been really good and really great in like walking us through the process since we're new to it, providing reviews at like the methodology stage, the cluster analysis results stage, and then eventually the calibration stage and the IGR stage. Data collection planning, as we talked about, all the data that's required. I guess just end with just kind of 2 general questions, maybe going into Q&A, like does this ultimately save us time, and is it less complex, or does it add complexity and labor? And I guess we're kind of still thinking about that. And also, how can we apply this to smaller models, maybe with less data, less budget, and maybe different facilities, clients might be willing to pay or to agree to larger budgets on interstate projects because of FHWA approval, but maybe not on a small congested arterial. So